Hey comrades, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about industrial relations and whether it is a useful skill set for today's modern HR business partner. So I'll be honest, industrial relations was the part of HR that I really enjoyed the least. In this video, I'll be talking to you about the reasons why. Everyone is different and you might really enjoy it. And I'm hoping by the end of this video, you have a bit of an understanding as to whether it's something that you want to pursue and it's a direction that you want to take your career in. So let's start off with a quick definition. Industrial relations, it's essentially about the employment relationship. It's about how things work between employee and employer. Who has the power, who doesn't? How does conflict get resolved? So that's a bit of a theoretical definition, a little bit philosophical, but it really plays out in the workplace in terms of the laws and regulations and enterprise agreements and the ways that things are governed, how things get done in the workplace. So when I was preparing for this video and doing my research, I actually went back to what I studied during my HR degree almost 15 years ago. It's been really interesting going through what I was studying back then now, because I have so much more real life experience and understanding of how organizations work to draw upon versus what I had when I was a student, which is one of the reasons that I recommend that if you are thinking about studying a master's degree, I recommend that you get a lot of work experience prior to doing so. I get lots of questions on LinkedIn and Twitter from people about, should I study a master's degree? In particular, should I study a master's in HR? And I do have some views on this, and I've put together a video, which I'll include in the description, where I go into more detail as to whether you should study a master's of HR or whether you shouldn't. So make sure you check that out if you are thinking about that. So I've provided a brief definition of industrial relations, but I also wanted to talk about the theoretical perspectives or the theoretical approaches on industrial relations. And there are three key approaches. There is the pluralist approach, the unitarist, and also the radical approach. So the pluralist approach to industrial relations, or the pluralist perspective, it assumes that there will be conflict. It's inevitable that there's going to be conflict in the workplace and there's going to be disagreement. And the disagreement is going to happen between two key groups, employers and employees. And under a pluralist perspective, they really recognize the importance and the role that unions play. So I've worked in a few different organizations which have had a really strong union presence, and it's been really clear that there's been a lot of conflict, there's been a lot of tension there. And the unions and management were often having disagreements about how to do things. And so that was, for me, a real clear example of a pluralist approach, a pluralist perspective on industrial relations. There was a lot of conflict in the workplace. So the unitarist approach, or the unitarist perspective to industrial relations, it's very different, and it views conflict as a failing of leadership or a failing of communication. And the unitarist approach to industrial relations, it assumes that employees and managers, or employees and leaders, they're both united and working towards a common goal. They have a common purpose and they're all striving towards that and trying to achieve the business's goals. And under a unitarist perspective to industrial relations, they see unions as a bit of an intrusion and a failing on management's part if employees elect to have a union involved in the workplace. So the final perspective or approach is the radical approach, which is very similar to the pluralist perspective in terms of the acknowledgement and the recognition of conflict in the workplace. But the radical approach places more importance and more acknowledgement on conflict. It examines conflict with reference to the conflict that is inherent in capitalism and society as a whole. So there is a bit of a macro view on conflict in terms of the workplace and society. So this is a very simple explanation of all of this, but the radical approach calls upon and references elements of Marxism in terms of the different class groups and the class warfare that exists. This is a really simple explanation, but under that kind of premise, from an industrial relations perspective, there is the bourgeois class, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, and they're the ones who own the means of production. They're the ones who own the warehouse and the factory and the resources. And then you also have the proletariat, which is the employees. And there is often power struggles and conflict between those two. And that's another way of looking at industrial relations through that lens. And throughout my career, I have worked with some union officials who have been really into all of that stuff, and they've taken it quite seriously in terms of the power balance and unions being able to fight back against that bourgeois class, but it hasn't really been that common a theme. So what is it that you do when it comes to industrial relations? Well, it's really going to depend on the role and the company and also whether there is a union presence in the company that you're working in. So this is a list of the types of work that you would do as an industrial relations professional or as an HR professional who has to do elements of industrial relations. And I'll take you through each of those briefly and provide a bit of an explanation so you have an understanding of what they involve. So let's talk about the first one, which is industrial instrument interpretation and advice. So this one here, this is where you have to take a question from a leader or from an employee and you have to look up the relevant industrial instruments. So that might be legislation, or it might be an enterprise agreement, or it might be an award, and you have to interpret it and then provide advice to your employees or to your leaders around how to apply your interpretation in the workplace. If you are currently studying HR and you're really enjoying the law subjects, then you might enjoy this type of work when you start your career. So next up is policy development. And this is where you will create or develop policies and procedures that your employees and leaders can use in the workplace. So you might take legislation, or you might take some form of award or agreement, and you will write a policy based on that legislation. And in some cases, you might provide something above and beyond what the legislation is providing. In other cases, you might write a policy or procedure and explain how things should be done in the workplace. And in some cases, it won't have anything to do with the legislation, but you're providing guidance to your employees on how they should do things. Developing a work from home policy is a key example of something that you would be doing. Okay, so a key part of industrial relations is dealing with and working with unions. And how much you have to deal with and work with unions will depend on the industry and the workplace and the role that you are performing. As I mentioned earlier, I've worked in workplaces which have had zero union presence, and I've worked in other workplaces which have had a really strong union presence. And just to provide a quick and simple explanation of what a union is, essentially it is an employee representative group. So employees are free to join a union, or at least in Australia, and they can ask that union to represent them on matters regarding their work. And in some cases, they might ask the union to bargain with the company to get them better conditions, or if there is a discipline matter or an investigation and they need a support person, they might ask a union delegate to accompany them. And in the event that the company is introducing something that employees may not like or agree with, essentially they are asking the union to fight on their behalf and to argue with the company about what they're trying to implement. So your job as an HR professional or an industrial relations practitioner is to work with the unions and to work with the company and try to broker an outcome and try to work through the issues and find a solution that works for everyone. But obviously, as you are acting as a company representative, you're going to be driving what is best for the business. So I wanted to talk about the next one. It is actually 3 components of industrial relations work, but they can flow from one to another. And the first one is investigations, the second one is disciplinary conferences, and the third one is terminations. So those are all examples of industrial relations work, which is essentially the pointy end, the hard end of HR. And so as an HR practitioner, you will be responsible for carrying out an investigation. So an example might be your company receives an anonymous complaint about theft or about poor behaviors by an employee, and it's your job to investigate, take witness statements, meet with the employee who is accused of doing the wrong thing, and determine if there is any substance to the claim. From an investigation, there sometimes will be a disciplinary conference, which is where you have to put allegations to the employee, understand their responses, and then determine an appropriate disciplinary sanction. So you might determine that it is a written warning or a final written warning, or you might determine actually the response that the employee has given, it refutes the allegations, and so in that instance there will be no disciplinary action. And in some cases the sanction might be quite serious and it might lead to termination of employment, and you will have to guide the company in the way to terminate the employee in a fair way and a way that minimizes risk to the company. So those are some of the things that you would do. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my experiences in terms of industrial relations work. I remember back to when I first started my career as an HR professional, I was dealing with an employee disciplinary issue. And the manager and I, we met with the union delegate and the employee, and we put the allegations to them, and the employee provided some responses, and then the union delegate asked to meet with the leader and myself without the employee present. And so we had a conversation with them, and the union delegate said, oh look, they've clearly done the wrong thing, they're really sorry. Obviously, you're well within your rights to give a written warning. So the leader and I were like, okay, yep, we'll bring them back in and we'll give them the disciplinary outcome. And so we brought the employee back in, and the leader said, oh, we decided that we're gonna give you a written warning. And then the union delegate started yelling and carrying on and saying, oh, this is an outrage, this employee is a cog in this machine and you'll be hearing from us, this is a disgrace, and all this stuff. And I remember thinking like literally just 2 seconds ago, you've said like, this is what you think is reasonable and what you think is okay. And at the time, I hadn't really appreciated, I guess, the song and dance kind of nature of industrial relations. There will be times when you are dealing with union delegates and union officials where they have to, in some cases, put on a bit of a show. And in some cases, they will make things, they will make it look like there is more conflict there than there is. And in some cases, they'll get quite angry at you and you know, really have a bit of a go at you. But in a lot of cases, it's really just part of the game, so to speak. Which for me, I kind of struggled with, and I didn't I guess like that nature of industrial relations, and I didn't really like the conflict nature, because in some cases I had really good relationships with union delegates, and so I understood they were just playing a role, and when they were yelling at me and swearing at me and stuff, it was just part of that game. But in other cases, it did get quite serious, and I don't know about all of you, but personally, I don't really like and enjoy being yelled at and sworn at. Obviously, everyone's different, but speaking within my network, there are a lot of HR professionals who look at jobs, and when they read through the description and they understand what it involves, if there's a lot of industrial relations, a lot of this type of work where you're dealing with lots of grievances and disputes and investigations, a lot of them, they're not really that interested in it. It takes a special kind of person, someone with a lot of resilience, someone who enjoys arguing and debating to really enjoy that type of work. So if you were thinking about industrial relations as a career and you don't really enjoy arguing and you don't really have a really well-developed, thick skin, you might want to think about it again. I know someone who was talking about an industrial relations role that they had done, and they were leaving after 3 years, and they knew the person who was taking over from them, and they said, if you last 12 months, I'll be really impressed. It's that type of work where if you can last a certain amount of time, you're really achieving something. So something to think about. So at the start of the video, I asked whether industrial relations was a useful skill set for today's modern HR business partner. And it really is going to depend on the country that you're in and the way that work is shaping up. I know that in Australia, unionism is on the decline. Obviously, that could change in the future. And the reason that I mention that is because where there are unions, the industrial relations workload is obviously going to be higher, because the employees have a union representative to argue with the company and to bargain on their behalf. So the question is, are you developing a skill set that is going to decline in time? Will it be less relevant and less sought after in the future? So I hope this has given you a good understanding of how industrial relations works and whether it is the right career choice for you. Ultimately, you need to make that decision for yourself, and in some cases you might need to try it and see what it's like. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. I have made some other videos on how to learn about HR and different things that happen in an HR career. So last week I put together a video where I play two characters. One is a boss called George, and one is an HR character called Dave, which is myself. And it seems to be doing really well. If you are interested in that type of content and you'd like to see more of Dave and George having HR discussions, please let me know in the comments section. Hope you have a great day. Thanks again for taking the time to watch, and I will see you in the next video.